It's always interesting to have the news of miracles, alleged miracles, because they haven't exactly been fully investigated by Rome yet. But it's good to have these kind of stories, especially when they are plausible. I tend to be very restrained, is a good word, when it comes to alleged prophecies from alleged mystics that are being reported today because it's all too easy to fake them or to misinterpret them. Miracles can have the same kind of problem. But you'll see in this story today, there's a number of reasons to err on the side of belief on this one. And that's because we're talking about Saint Charbel, a saint who is not well enough known in the Latin West, a 19th century monk who has something like 30,000 miracles associated with him. Yes, 30,000 miracles, one of the great saints of the modern era. He should be understood and taught more from the Ambo by priests than he certainly is, partially because he is a Maronite saint associated with a liturgical tradition that is not, strictly speaking, Roman. And I think that has a lot to do with why he is not as well known. And we're going to start with good news today before we go to more news of the day. So if you like stories like this and the news of the day from the church, even if it's usually bad news, hit like and subscribe. It does help. So let's go to LifeSite News for our story under the headline here of no medical explanation. Two miracles attributed to Saint Charbel this year so far. And so far is a good way to look at it because he was a 19th century figure. And when you have a 19th century figure with 30,000 miracles associated with him, it is safe to say that the saint may very well continue to be active in the lives of regular, everyday Catholics who put their trust in Jesus Christ and through his servants in the hereafter, like Saint Charbel. Because that's one of the points of miracles is to be a sign of faith for those who do not believe, as you'll see. There are two new miracles for him, and then the article goes a little bit over the 30,000 miracle spanning 133 countries from the Arab saints' intercession. Here's the first one. Quote, according to Mer Television, a major station in Lebanon, attorney Georgianne Walker, who was born in South Bend, Indiana in 1975, recounted that in December 2024, she suffered a serious infection following an abdominal surgery, which caused her severe pain and constant anxiety. Medicating this condition with antibiotics for 6 weeks helped remedy the symptoms of the infection, yet a surgical wound remained open and inflamed and would not heal. Despite all efforts from her surgeon and other medical professionals, the wound remained unchanged and without any improvement. For 10 months, she was burdened with changing her bandages every day to the constant bleeding and discharge. As a final hope for her medical remedy, her surgeon decided another operation was in order to remove the inflamed tissue and set a date for the surgery. In September 2025, Mer Television reported that God sent her a friend named George Issa, who had himself been healed through the intercession of Saint Charbel 3 years earlier. Bringing with him a flask of blessed oil associated with the Lebanese saint, he said to her, if you believe in his intercession with the Lord Jesus Christ, ask for it and anoint your wound with the oil. Georgianne says she prayed with a faithful heart and anointed her wound with the Saint Charbel oil, and it healed completely. She was fully cured and no longer needed the scheduled surgery. She declared, quoting her directly, I firmly believe that Saint Charbel healed me through his intercession, and I experienced this miracle myself. All thanks to Saint Charbel and George Issa, who gave me the Saint Charbel oil because they changed the course of my life. End quote. The use of blessed oil as a sacramental has long been a popular pious practice in the Eastern Christian tradition. Such oil gains devotional connection to Saint Charbel when it comes into contact with his relics at the Maronite monastery in Anania, Lebanon. And her friend's miracle was officially recorded on January 17th, 2026. And we'll go here into another story from this year in just a moment. So she tried the normal medical scientific way of taking care of the problems first, and they didn't seem to work to the point where they were going to do more drastic measures to try to relieve her of her pains and of her wound. And then a friend came to her and told her to essentially use a sacramental, an outward sign of faith, in prayer, asking for the intercession of Saint Charbel. She did so, and she was cured. I'm sure the Vatican will eventually get around to investigating this officially. Pray for that investigation, that the truth of the matter come out. I do tend to err on the side of this was true, but again, the Vatican does have their own investigatory procedures. Although I will remind you, if you read the Marian document, the document on not Marian titles, not the co-redemptrix document, but the one before it, where they declared that they were not going to be in the business of declaring things of supernatural origin anymore. Well, we shall see how that applies to saints, because this could be the first test of that. Now, into the second case. Again, reporting this to you on January 30th of 2026. Two reported so far. A second miracle this year involved a young lady closer to the tomb of the saint in Lebanon. Rasha Charbel, who has no known relation to the saint, was born in Jazin, Lebanon in 1987, and due to severe back pain was admitted to the hospital October 1st, 2025. An MRI exam discovered a tumor on her spine known as meningioma, measuring 2.3 centimeters in size and 0.3 centimeters in thickness. Her physician, Dr. Christian Atia, a specialist in neurosurgery and vascular surgery, explained that since this type of tumor was resistant to medication and posed a risk to the arteries and nerves of the spine, it could only be removed by means of surgery. A follow-up MRI was scheduled 3 months out to assess the tumor's development, with a preliminary hospital admission date set for January 7th, 2026, should surgery be necessary. The night prior to her scheduled admission, which was the Feast of the Epiphany, the 6th day of January, 2026, Rasha says she reached up to a picture of St. Charbel that was hanging over her bed in her bedroom, touched it, and said a prayer for healing before falling into a deep sleep. The next morning, on the 7th, she arrived at the hospital for her MRI exam and was told the process would take around 45 minutes and perhaps more if a contrast injection was needed. However, the scan was completed in just 20 minutes, revealing a perplexing result. The tumor had vanished without a trace. The doctor told her clearly there is no medical explanation for its disappearance, and it is impossible for it to disappear without surgery. On the 17th, Rasha paid a visit of thanksgiving to St. Marin Monastery in Anaya, Lebanon, where she officially recorded her miracle, accompanied by all her medical reports. She gave thanks for the blessing of healing she had received and affirmed that what had happened had changed her life and deepened her faith. That is an interesting thing by itself, and all of these things will help, hopefully, fuel more investigations into this. Not that there's a shortage of miracles associated with Saint Charbel. I'm sure they'll just add them to the pile. It gets them eventually. But he is one of the most active saints of our time. And this is one of the reasons why I think he should be made more known outside of the Eastern rites. He should be more well known in the West. In fact, in some places in the United States, at least, of all the Eastern liturgical traditions, you're more likely to find a Maronite parish in your community than some others, at least in the communities I've lived in. I've lived in Portland, Oregon, where there's a very well-known Maronite parish. And I live currently in central Oklahoma, and over in Norman, there is another Maronite parish. Go figure. They're around. And if you're going to familiarize yourself with any Eastern rite, which you should do, and to appreciate their liturgical traditions and the beauty of the faith as expressed through their culture, the Maronites are one of the more easier to access for many Catholics today because of some of the liturgical things that they do. Now, you should do a little research before you do something like that. It goes on to talk about the things that the Pope has said about this, because the Pope Leo visited the tomb of St. Charbel last year, and here's what he had to say when he did. He said, "What is the legacy of this man who wrote nothing, who lived a hidden and silent life, yet whose fame spread throughout the world? The Holy Spirit formed him so that he could teach those who live without God how to pray, those who live immersed in noise how to be silent, those who live ostentatiously how to be modest, and those who seek riches how to be poor. All of these behaviors are countercultural. Yet that is precisely why they attract us, just like fresh, pure water draws those walking in the desert." End quote. Some of the best words from Pope Leo XIV in his entire pontificate were said in relation to St. Charbel. Good news, I think, to kick off your weekend, as it is a Friday that I'm reporting this. If all you want to hear is good news today, well, this is your cue, because we're going to go on to the news of the day now. We are aware in the West of vocations crisis, and it's attacked every single part of the vocations in the church except for the permanent diaconate. And that's because there really wasn't a permanent diaconate before Vatican II, but there is one now. And it's one of the few places that are growing. A lot of theories as to why that is. But what we're looking at today is the actual state of religious vocations, specifically those who make perpetual vows. The news ain't good. These are the prayer warriors of the church. If you ever read G.K. Chesterton's poem Lepanto, he makes a very clear reference to the silent prayer warriors of the faith being targeted by Satan in that poem. It's a magnificent poem. I recommend reading it if you can find it online. It should be easy. Just type in G.K. Chesterton, Lepanto, and you'll find the poem. But the state of those who take perpetual vows is really, really not good. So here we go to zenit.org for this story under the headline, "This is what religious with perpetual vows in the U.S. say are like, according to the CARA 2025 survey." CARA is a Catholic research organization. They are a Catholic organization that goes after all this data to find out what the state of the church is and belief is. CARA data is one of those that shows that very few Catholics believe in the real presence, as just an example. They're very active and they do good work. The Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, or CARA, Georgetown University's research arm for Catholic life, has released its annual survey of women and men who professed perpetual vows in 2025 within religious institutes, provinces, or monasteries based in the United States. Maybe not as useful for those of you outside of the US, although I would expect you would find similar numbers in your country, unless you live in a place where the vocations to religious life are doing exceptionally well. It's from the article. At a time when religious life in the United States is often described in terms of aging communities and shrinking numbers, a new national study offers a more nuanced portrait, one that combines demographic realism with signs of enduring vocational vitality. This is a positive filter through this. The Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate has released its annual survey of women and men who professed perpetual vows in 2025 within religious institutes, provinces, or monasteries based in the U.S. Perpetual profession marks a definitive commitment to consecrated life, following years of formation and temporary vows. It is, in effect, the moment when a vocation becomes irrevocable. To assemble the profession class of 2025, they contacted major superiors across the country, working through networks identified by the U.S. Bishop's Secretariat of Clergy, Consecrated Life, and Vocations. Of 723 superiors approached, 520 responded, a solid 72% response rate, which, by the way, I am a trained social scientist, got my PhD in a social science field. A 72 response rate for surveys is crazy good. That is incredible. These leaders reported a total of 179 religious who made perpetual vows in 2025, 74 women and 105 men. So, to be clear, 520 superiors for religious across the United States responded and told people there were 79 people who made perpetual vows that year, or 179. That's not good. From that group, 130 sisters, brothers, and priests completed CARA's detailed questionnaire, yielding a participation rate of 73%. Also very good. The overall institutional picture remains sobering. More than 4 in 5 responding superiors said their communities had no perpetual professions at all last year. So, 82% of abbots, mother superiors, and the like said that their communities had no perpetual professions at all in 2024. 82%. Only 10% reported a single new member making final vows, while just 8% recorded between 2 and 9. Still, behind these aggregate figures stands 179 individuals who freely chose lifelong consecration. And thanks be to God for the 179. The average age of the 2025 profession class is 38, though half are 35 or younger. The youngest respondent was 22, the oldest, 74, an unusually wide age range that reflects the increasingly diverse pathways into religious life. Men made up 55% of the respondents, women 45. While religious life in the U.S. is gradually becoming more international, meaning you're getting a lot more monks and nuns from overseas living religious life in the U.S., most of this cohort remains homegrown. 69% were born in the U.S., yet nearly a third come from abroad, 12% from Asia, 9% from Latin America, and 7% from Africa, underscoring the growing global character of American Catholic communities. Ethnically, 57% identify as Caucasian or European American. 16% describe themselves as Asian or Pacific Islander. Another 16% is Hispanic or Latino. 9% is African or African American. And 3% is mixed race or other. Continuity of faith within families remains striking. 92% have been Catholic since birth, and that should not shock you. Your vocations in the church overwhelmingly come from Catholic families who lived Catholic lives, or at least tried their best to live Catholic lives. You live a life of faith as a family, you get vocations. And among converts, the average age of conversion was just 20. So if they converted, they did so young. Almost all respondents had at least one Catholic parent, and 85% were raised in households where both parents were Catholic. More than a third report having a priest or religious among their relatives, a reminder of how vocations often emerge within already faith-saturated environments. And if you know the history of this question at all, that data does not shock you. It used to be, when Catholics used to have large families, that if you had 7 children in a family, you could expect one priest or religious to come from that family. That's how it used to be. And then Catholics started contracepting at the same rates as everybody else. Started having 2.1 children, marginally above the national average. And the vocations withered up. One of the main driving factors of the vocations crisis, along with the so-called reforms of Vatican II. A 1-2 punch that left vocations crippled. There's no nice way to describe this. It's a very real problem. The remedy is simple, of course. Simple, so simple, in fact, that it's impossible to do. And that is simply to teach the classical Catholic faith, once again, from our bishops, for them to stop being so political, and for Catholic families to stop contracepting and to take God's great command to heart, to be fruitful and multiply, meaning to adhere to the church's teaching on such matters. You know, the bedroom stuff, the stuff we don't talk about in polite company, to actually live as Catholics should live in those regards. And no, I'm not taking to task anybody who had a history of being more like the mainstream here, but has since repented of it and has some sorrow about it. You are not who I'm talking about. I'm not interested in going after those who have had change of heart on how they lived. We do too much of that these days, going after people who have sins in their past or actively combating sins in their lives, and yet people still give them a hard time. I'm not interested in participating in that. So please do not mistake what I am saying here. But there are plenty of people who invoke their personal conscience because they hear this from the church, which is that the church cannot, nobody in the church can coerce you, that you have the right to live according to your personal conscience, your well-informed personal conscience. And so people think well-informed personal conscience means that, well, the church says this one thing, but the science says this, so we're going to go with what the science says. A well-informed personal conscience means that you trust that the church is infallible on faith and morals, that you know what the church teaches, and that no one can coerce you to do differently. Well, let's say, for an example, if a bishop said, y'all ought to stop breeding like rabbits, to quote Pope Francis, and so here's this little blue pill that'll take care of your problem for you. Your personal conscience, formed by the church, should give you enough to tell that bishop, no, thank you, and maybe to tell him what the church teaches, and to resist him to his face on this. But instead, we get smaller and smaller families, fewer and fewer vocations. So 179 men and women religious in 2025, reported by 520 of the superiors in the United States. Not good numbers, but we should thank God for every single one of them. They're the prayer warriors whose quiet lives of prayer behind the scenes will bear great fruits for us moving forward to try to restore the faith in the church. So please pray, I guess, in thanksgiving for what we have gotten in terms of vocations, and pray for more vocations. Something to consider as we head towards Lent. Focus for your Lenten sacrifices and things is to make atonements for your own sins, of course, but also to do something spiritually to help foster vocations, because we need men and women religious as much as, if not more than, we need priests. I know that's a radical statement because priests give us sacraments, but the priests get their support from not only the prayers of the laity, but the prayers of religious as well. So take that to heart. Now, another thing we need to be worried about is this. Yet again, the bishops of the church have decided to become radical extreme activists. The U.S. Conference of Democrat Bishops is what I'm increasingly calling these men, keep hammering home on immigration, 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 immigration. That's all they care about. That is all these men care about. And they've been like this since Doge announced that they had found a whole lot of money going to NGOs to help subvert the United States through the mass movement of people. That's what they found. And so they started taking the proper steps to stop this. And U.S. government funding to nonprofits, including Catholic Charities and other U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops organizations, got cut dramatically. And since then, the bishops have been just in a frenzy about this, going so far as to make immigration the pressing moral issue of our time, which had for like 50 years been solely held by the sacrifice of the most young to Moloch. The state of the health of kids that have yet to be born was their great concern. And now it's immigration, to the point where they're fanning the flames of discontent. And you'll see this here. Posted to X by none other than Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church himself. Excuse me. Quoting him, news, letter from the multiple Catholic leaders in the U.S., including archbishops, bishops, religious order superiors, priests, and members of men's and women's religious orders to the U.S. Senate. Immigration policy should be guided by human dignity and social stability. I agree that much with social stability, because what it turns out is if you want to destabilize a country, one of the ways you can do it is to bring in a whole bunch of people who cannot and will not become part of the social fabric. I won't read you the whole letter, although it's actually really short. Actually, yeah, let's go over the whole letter. Here we go. Dated the 28th of January. Dear members of the U.S. Senate, we write to you as Catholic leaders entrusted with the pastoral care of families and communities across our nation. We do so to express our deep opposition to the Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill scheduled for a vote this week. At the time of recording of this, that bill is still up in the air. There has been a preliminary temporary passage of things for the Democrats to look at it some more, meaning probably to find a new way to oppose it. But we'll continue. Our concerns are grounded in the message issued by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in November, which addressed the vilification of immigrants and expressed a clear opposition to indiscriminate mass deportation. Catholic social teaching affirms that the family is the basic unit of society, willed by God and deserving of protection in law and public policy. Recent immigration enforcement actions carried out under DHS authority have heightened our concern that this fundamental principle is being compromised. In many communities, enforcement practices have resulted in families being separated with little warning or recourse. Parents have been detained without the opportunity to prepare their children. Spouses have lost partners suddenly and without clarity about what will follow. These realities undermine family stability and inflict lasting harm, particularly on children. For these reasons, we cannot support legislation that expands or sustains enforcement practices without adequately addressing their consequences for families and communities. A DHS budget that prioritizes detention and removal while lacking strong safeguards for family unity, due process, and accountability risks entrenching harm rather than promoting justice or public safety. Recent responses to peaceful protest and public dissent have only intensified concerns about the disproportionate use of force and the erosion of civil liberties. We urge senators not to advance funding for immigration and customs enforcement, that would be ICE, and customs and border protection in current appropriations package. Congress has demonstrated through bipartisan collaboration on things like affordable housing and access to essential medications that it is capable of legislating in ways that strengthen families and serve the common good. Immigration policy should be guided by the same commitment to human dignity and social stability. And particularly, we ask that immigration enforcement policy be shaped by the following principles. The family unit remains a guiding principle of immigration enforcement policy. That all persons be treated with respect and care and recognition of their inherent dignity. That alternatives to detention be prioritized whenever possible. And a strong oversight, accountability, and restorative mechanisms be in place to prevent these kind of harms that devastate families and communities. Our faith calls us to recognize Christ in every person. This includes the migrant, the refugee, and the child who bears the pain of separation. Disregard that suffering is to turn away from a core moral responsibility we share as a society. We pray that your deliberations will be guided by wisdom and restraint. May your decisions reflect a genuine commitment to protecting families, upholding human dignity, and serving the common good. Respectfully signed by a lot of bishops. A lot of bishops. It's a staggering amount of them. It's all the bad ones and a whole lot of ones you thought were good. You know, John Stowe is there from Lexington. No one is surprised by him. You got a lot of well-known priests signing this in their dioceses. You've got a lot of auxiliary bishops signing this. And it goes on because that letter was just like 1.3 pages, and then the rest of this are the signatories. And it's fairly easy to rebut this. Statistically speaking, 70% of those who were apprehended by immigration law enforcement were people who were wanted and had a deportation order for being nasty criminals, committing nasty crimes on top of illegally entering the country. They would happen to grab other people who they knew weren't supposed to be here if they were traveling with them, living with them, or in close proximity to them. And in the case of families, well, Tom Homan said rather bluntly that they will send them all back where they came from together. I know that's not the answer people want, but that is what the administration is doing. Is there dignity? Well, sure, except when you flee from law enforcement, you surrender your dignity. Human beings do not possess infinite dignity, no matter what Vatican documents say on the matter, because the only being that possesses infinite anything is God. Now, there are other ways to approach this, I'm sure, so let me know them in the comments if you like. Do so with respect with one another if you're going to actually debate these issues. We're not trying to cause people to just foam at the mouth and have angry responses to things, because after all, we're not the Vatican here, and we're not the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I bring all of them up because we, on the night of January 29th, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops posted this to X. I won't go over the full post that's on their original page. This is from the official X account of the U.S. Conference of Democrat Bishops. They posted the following. Bishop chairman call on administration to extend protections for Haitians in the United States. We're deeply concerned about the plight of our Haitian brothers and sisters living in the U.S. who will soon have their legal status and work authorization revoked to the administration's termination of TPS for Haiti. TPS is the special protections given to them as a group. There's simply no realistic opportunity for the safe and orderly return of people to Haiti at this time. Now, this is because of some of the rather outlandish sounding stories that emerged during the campaign about people from Haiti. You know the stories I'm talking about, pets and all the rest. That seemed absolutely outlandish unless you watched the actual testimony of people in some of these towns at their city council meetings talking about things they saw firsthand. Pretty nasty stuff. And it's understandable that the bishops would say, hey, maybe have some mercy on some people. But at the end of the day, Catholic social teaching teaches one thing that these bishops have never paid more than lip service to. And it's not the part about Caesar having the right to enforce his laws. It's the duty of the migrant to obey the laws, and especially to assimilate. That is explicitly laid out in Catholic social teaching, that those who come to a new country need to live as the locals do, while keeping the faith, of course. Why don't they mention that? That's the core of that issue with that group of people. Why do the bishops never mention that responsibility? Let me know in the comments why you think that is. Aside from, of course, the obvious concern about money. Because certainly we would never dare to suggest that the U.S. bishops only care about the money they receive to care for these groups. Right? Case in point, the Vatican has chimed in on the things going on in Minnesota. We go here to that website that it can in no way be called a radical traditionalist website here, vaticannews.va. Think of the BBC for the Vatican, and I'm sure a lot of people don't like that comparison because the BBC is very corrupt, but this is state media for the Vatican we're talking about. The headline, Cardinal Parolin, violence in Minnesota is unacceptable. Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin speaks to journalists about the environment of tension in the state, the Holy See's position on the Board of Peace, and diplomatic talks on Greenland. You would be forgiven for thinking that the Vatican, that the new pope was chosen in part to stand in opposition to the new president, that a lot of his episcopal appointments seem to reflect that. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, his words on all this, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they had such a weird obsession with the man who will not be president in 2 years. Well, 3 years. That this pope will statistically probably outlast Donald Trump by a long time in terms of holding office. And yet they spend a lot of time thinking about him. Here are the details from the Vatican News article. It opens with a quote from the Cardinal Secretary of State. The position of the Holy See is always to avoid any kind of violence, obviously, and therefore we cannot accept episodes of this kind, what we see in Minnesota. That is our position, as you know. Those are the words of Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin, responding to questions from journalists concerning immigrations and customs enforcement agents' operations in Minnesota in the U.S., which have resulted in the death of 2 U.S. citizens. Difficulties, problems, and contradictions must be resolved in other ways, added the Secretary of State, aligning himself with an earlier statement from the U.S. bishops and describing the situation as unacceptable. Do you see what he's doing here? He's blaming law enforcement for it. Many of you may actually agree with him. I don't, because I know the kinds of people who are doing that agitation. They're hammer and sickle ideologists, the lot of them. They have in their own chat groups and things been orchestrating, like planning illicit, violent responses to law enforcement. And remember what I said earlier, 70% of the people they're gathering up to send home are people who already have deportation orders. They had their due process. They received a deportation order years ago that was never enforced. So now they're enforcing it. So, of course, Parolin says about the Board of Peace, there are problematic aspects. Remember, the established Board of Peace, if you want to call it that, is the United Nations, an organization that has proved itself to be not terribly useful for most things, including preserving peace. The Secretary of State then also commented on the open letter sent to him yesterday by the Network of Priests Against a Large-Scale Ending of Life, which urges the Holy See not to be part of the Board of Peace currently being set up under the leadership of U.S. President Donald Trump. He was asked whether the Vatican made a decision on whether or not to participate. One always has to respond after a while. Let us think about it for a moment, Cardinal Parolin added, adding that he understands the concern. He then reiterated what he had told the press days earlier on the same issue, specifying that faced with this proposal, there were indeed problematic points that needed to be taken into consideration, and that would be evaluated in view of a response. The response has not yet been given, but I believe one cannot forget the problematic aspects of this plan. And then it turned out that the law enforcement agents in the U.S. in question are going to be used as security at the Olympics, which is causing an international scandal. Whatever. But that's the Vatican, chiming in the way the Vatican always does. I'm very curious what you think about this in the comments. Do you agree with Philip here? That's where he says maybe they should recommend people avoid the near occasion of sin of violently opposing legitimate function of the state, the fourth commandment, and tell them to stay home. That's a novel idea. That'd be totally within the purview of the bishops to say law enforcement should be more merciful, should act with greater care to respect the dignity of persons, and that those who are protesting should also remember this and actually not engage in violent acts. That would be totally within their purview. But you never hear that. And that's the glaring part about this. That's why they get called the U.S. Conference of Democratic Bishops, because they are so overtly partisan that you have to be willfully blind to not see it. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments. And as a general thing, please pray for everybody involved in this, because at the core immigration question is one of illicit moving of human people around, to paraphrase what Napoleon says here in the chat. There's no dignity in that. There is none. You are subverting the laws of the host country, often bringing in people who are desperate to change their lives so they can be exploited for economic and political purposes, and sometimes way worse than that. I'm very curious what you think of all this, so let me know in the comments, please. So like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Share this on social media. That helps as well. Please pray for everybody we spoke about, especially those in a negative way today. They absolutely need your prayers, as do I. And please, as we move towards Lent, start thinking about making your Lenten sacrifices count, especially this year. And remember, Lent for many people starts off strong, and then at some point, 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, something happens to attempt to derail things very suspiciously, as if the devil himself does not like Catholics participating in Lent for some weird reason. So please remember that as we head into and towards Lent this year. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.